Please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Terry Martin, who will speak about the paradoxes of the Soviet Empire, the Russian question, and strategic primordialism.
Thanks, Misha. It's a honor to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you to Nazarbayev University. I'm very impressed by the steadfastness of everyone here who's still up for listening to still more academic talks after 10 hours. So I will try to keep everybody awake as much as I can. As Mikhail said, I wrote a book about the nationalities policy in the Soviet Union 20 years ago now, and I'll return to some of those ideas in this talk and try to develop some of what I see as the, I call it paradoxes in the title, or contradictions or tensions in the Soviet nationalities policy, and see what we can do about bringing the 1920s into dialogue with the collapse of the Soviet Union in that way. I'll begin with a little bit about empire, and then I'll turn to the contradictions in policy. So empire is very much a charismatic idea, and it's, I think, no coincidence that our conference has taken empire and colony as its organizing themes. The idea that the Soviet Union was in some objective sense an empire, and that the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1991, indeed collapsed because it was an empire, has grown increasingly entrenched in popular and scholarly discourse. Before hopping on the plane to this conference, seems a long time ago now, I did a quick book title search in Harvard's digital catalog. There were 351 titles of books that included Soviet Union and empire in their title, whereas there were only 25 with Soviet Union and multinational, 13 with Soviet Union and multi-ethnic. Soviet Empire got 1.9 million hits on a Google search. Soviet multi-ethnic, multinational state got 7,400. The one was by Martha Alcott and was republished under that title in 2019. The Russian invasions of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022 have unsurprisingly intensified this tendency. Increasingly, one finds in popular discourse around the wars, some of it even produced by professional scholars, the contemporary conflict between Russia and Ukraine in the imperial frame being projected back in time, hundreds and hundreds of years back further than when Ukraine and Russia even really existed in their modern sense. And it's that malleability and polemical charisma, if you will, of the term empire during the past century that's always inclined me to prefer approaching empire in this period, and certainly for the Soviet Union, as a subjective rather than an objective analytical category. The objective use of empire, where you posit it as a polity with a certain set of common characteristics, is particularly problematic for Soviet historians. No matter how we define our analytical categories, they almost always absorb something of their popular meaning. And I think our image of the modern empire is almost overwhelmingly the overseas empire, a nationally defined metropole, Britain, France, Spain, ruling over a spatially distinct periphery with different legal, political, social, and cultural systems prevailing in the metropole and the periphery, and also amongst the different peripheries, and an emphasis on preserving rather than eliminating difference. As many have pointed out, the Soviet Union did the exact opposite. It attempted to eliminate difference, create a common Soviet man, and a unitary state with a common legal, economic, political, and ideological system. The RSFSR hardly fit as a typical metropole in any meaningful sense. Maybe the city of Moscow did. Of course, of course, one can find all kinds of empire-like characteristics and instances of Russian privilege, always for the language, often for the status of Russians as first among equals, sometimes for access to political power, though hardly in a systematic way. Pioneering survey in the Brezhnev era found that in 12 of 14 non-Russian republics, titular nationals were felt to have an advantage in access to jobs, education, and party positions, and sometimes an overwhelming advantage. Belarus and Latvia, by the way, were the exceptions. So the question for me was, what is gained by labeling the USSR an empire? Even if one does gather together all its imperial characteristics, it is a sufficiently atypical empire that one gains little comparative utility. One gets to use the word and its charisma. If one is anti-Soviet, it has polemical value. Empires are bad. If one is explaining 1991, it has teleological value. Empires collapse. But I doubt that it has that much explanatory value. All right, that was my polemical introduction. And I can answer any questions on that after the talk. But just as I think that the objective use of empire is problematic in the Soviet case, I think the subjective approach is uniquely productive in understanding both the beginning and the end of the Soviet Union. And I'll try to bring those together in my talk. So I'll begin autobiographically. I was introduced to the subjective approach to empire by a 1995 article that was published by the political scientist Mark Beisinger. It's called The Persisting Ambiguity of Empire. And Beisinger observed that in nationalism studies, it was considered a category error to try to identify the objective traits of a nation, as Stalin famously did with his 4 traits in 1913. Everyone in the scholarly community accepted that nations were a subjective act of self-ascription, imagined communities being the most common. Beisinger was particularly influenced by Roger Brubaker's radical position that even nationality or national identity itself didn't persistently exist, but to many degrees was something that happened when the appropriate circumstances emerged. So Beisinger took this and applied the paradigm to empire and the Soviet collapse. He argued, surely correctly, that prior to 1985, a vanishingly small number of Soviet citizens believed they lived in an empire. During perestroika, an increasingly large number, a majority in some republics, came to believe that they did. Since in the modern world, empires are considered illegitimate and destined to collapse, they increasingly believed, as the perestroika went along into 1989-91, that first the Soviet Union could, and then indeed should collapse. In his reading, the Soviet Union did not collapse because it was an empire, but because it came to be perceived as an empire. So the subjective perception there did the work. It just so happened that when that article appeared, I was finishing the draft of my dissertation, which became the book that Misha so kindly described, An Affirmative Action Empire. And I had worked out what I thought to be the logic behind the highly unorthodox early Soviet policy of korenizatsiya, a form of non-Russian nation building, which of course Vladimir Putin has recently referenced with disgust in his speech justifying the war on Ukraine as being an inexplicable folly, but I thought I had an explanation for it nevertheless. And that logic came from a reading of recent history. In the most, paper sticking together here. In the most advanced countries, the expansion of markets, communication, and schooling had led to linguistic groups developing a common national identity and acting politically. When blocked by non-native leadership, separatist nationalism would emerge. The culmination of this process had been the collapse of the German, Habsburg, Ottoman, and Romanov empires in World War I. The Bolsheviks intended to establish a unitary and highly intrusive state, and to modernize the economy rapidly. If those actions were perceived as being Russian impositions, they would produce nationalism in this reading. Therefore, the Soviet state had to act prophylactically and aggressively to support the forms of nationhood that did not contradict the establishment of a unitary state and economy. And these would be the familiar national territories, cadres, languages, and cultures that we have studied. So Beisinger's argument made clear to me that the early Bolsheviks, Lenin and Stalin above all, understood perfectly well the subjective processes of empire perception. And indeed, what happened during Perestroika wouldn't be surprising in that sense to them, although it would have surprised them in many other ways. Because they had lived through an earlier iteration of the perceptual cascade that occurred during Perestroika, that is the one that occurred during World War I. And so the policy of Korenizatsiya was in fact designed to prevent the subjective perception of empire. So in that way, they would try to create a reversed or upside down, or in my American vocabulary, an affirmative action empire. So this paradox of building nations to prevent nationalism was there at the beginning and the end of the Soviet Union. It's now broadly understood. Even Putin has his opinions on it. And so I won't go further on it. But I want to, the question then sort of is, how do we come from a policy meant to forestall the subjective perception of empire to this perestroika cascade? What were the situations that made that possible or likely? So I want to address two paradoxes of the Soviet nationalities policy that became manifest under Stalin and that were inherited by his predecessors. So one of these was a tension between how you understood the nation. So on the one hand, as I've described, Korenizatsiya was based on an unambiguously modern constructivist view of the nation. The nation was something that came into being at a particular time due to economic and communicative developments. In that way, the Bolshevik view was not unlike a lot of the modernist theories of nationalism that we have today. And it would therefore eventually give way to other forms of identity. And this conception of the nation would eventually lead to the idea of the Sovietsky Narod as a new historical community, a concept that was launched by Khrushchev and continued somewhat haphazardly by Brezhnev, and which actually had its roots very much in the Stalin period. And it was continuous with the thinking of the original period. The second is what we often call a primordialist understanding of the nation, something that posits that even if the nation didn't exist all the way back to Adam and Eve, it had very, very deep roots, that modern nations were only the manifestation of these deep roots, and posited an almost teleological growth from those pre-modern roots to modern socialist nationhood. So this view really was not present in the 1920s. It emerged in the 1930s, and it was institutionalized in various ways, and the practice of having an inherited passport nationality being one of them, and the genre of ethnogenesis, which was devoted to tracing the deep historical roots of Soviet nations and fixing them on their current territories, was another. So the two discourses of the modernist discourse that posited the malleability of nationality and the primordialist coexisted really for the last 50 years of the Soviet Union. They could be reconciled, and people like Bromley and other ethnographers did attempt it. But they pointed in radically different directions. One to an eventual Soviet nation that would in some way transcend existing national identities. The other to the permanent preservation of sub-state socialist nations in a non-national friendship of the peoples, if you will. So I'll come back to that one since it developed earlier. The second tension concerned the position of the Russian nation within the USSR. And this was something that's always concerned me, and I think that we need to give more attention to, and that the current sort of crisis with the wars in the Ukraine shows the ongoing difficulty of Russian nationhood confining itself within an ethnic polity. So it was at the heart of Lenin and Stalin's one major disagreement about policy in the 1920s. And I feel this conflict has been systematically misunderstood. Lenin's preference, of course, was for creating a new national level above the RSFSR, and so what came to be the Soviet Union, into which the RSFSR, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasus would enter on a equal level. This has sometimes been interpreted as a form of national liberalism, of sense of giving more rights to the non-Russians than Stalin's plan of leaving the RSFSR as the highest level would have done, and reducing the status of the Russians. I think this is simply untrue. The policy of colonization would have functioned ideally in either model. Indeed, the policy was articulated in 1921 when it was assumed that the RSFSR would be the highest unit, and then repeated in similar but more detailed form in 1923 when the USSR had emerged. Lenin and Stalin both favored a unitary state and economy. Neither favored any meaningful non-Russian, or Russian for that matter, autonomy. Colonization was purely about the forms of nationhood. Federation was one of those forms. So why did Stalin actually resist Lenin's proposal so fiercely? He stated his reasons quite clearly, but they didn't get published in the Khrushchev era. They only got published in the Perestroika era, and seem to have been disregarded somewhat for that. Stalin objected to the creation of a separate Russian government. He said, Comrade Lenin's proposals will lead unavoidably to the creation of a Ruski Sikh with 8 autonomous republics, currently part of the RSFSR, excluded from it, Tatarstan, Turkestan, etc. It will unavoidably lead to the creation of 2 chambers in Moscow, Russian and federal. In the same year when Sultan Galiyev did indeed propose that the autonomous republics enter the Union directly rather than as ASSRs, Stalin again responded, such a proposal demands dissolving our federation into pieces, together with the creation of a Ruski Sikh, not a Rossiyski Sikh, but a Ruski Sikh, and a Ruski Sovnarkom. Later, when in 1926, Mikoyan proposed uniting the 2 accession autonomous republics, Stalin again insisted, somewhat, off the alarmist, one might say, that this would lead to a cascade of ASSRs leaving the RSFSR and the creation of what he called a Ruskaya Republic. Warning, these are the sprouts of Ruski nationalism, and this is the most dangerous form of nationalism. So this Ruski-Rossiyski distinction, which was not always, between the ethnic and a civic identity, which was not always actually used in that way in the time period, was very much by Stalin and was clearly of fundamental importance to him. He reiterated again in 1925 in opposition to proposals to create a Ruskaya Communist Party along the lines of a Ukrainian Cossack. If they're all equal, why not? And you have as part of the all-union Communist Party. And he said again, we do not in fact have a Ruski Republic. There is the Rossiyskaya Federated Republic. It is not Ruskaya, it is Rossiyskaya. Okay, so Stalin opposed giving the Russians their own national institutions based in Moscow. He gave way to Lenin as they on it, but he never liked it, as they could and would become seedbeds for Russian nationalism, the most dangerous form of nationalism. This is actually one of the most consistent positions that he held throughout his career on nationalities policy, as late as 1949, when he was making up charges for the Leningrad affair, purging various of his officials. The charges he made up were that they were using the institutions of the RSFSR for Russian national resistance to the center. The charges were, of course, false, but the fact that he returned to them, I think, is striking. So Stalin, I think one must give him credit here, saw quite clearly the possibility that a future Yeltsin would use the institutions of the Russian Republic to attack the all-Union institutions and the danger that had for the idea of the Lenin Soviet Union. As my colleague Sergei Plokhy has pointed out, Putin got it wrong in his speech claiming Lenin created modern Ukraine. Both Lenin and Stalin acknowledged the existence of Ukraine and gave it status and they both equally supported national institutions to keep it under Bolshevik rule. But Lenin was the first Russian leader to support sub-state national institutions for Russia and the Russians. And to that extent, Sergei has argued, could be considered the father of modern Russia. And here Stalin did not support him. They both supported downplaying Russian national institutions. As you can see, Stalin doesn't want the RSFSR to be a Russian institution. In service of the agenda of Korenizatsiya, but for somewhat different reasons. Lenin's concern was always velika державный chauvinism, as he called it, great power chauvinism, the tendency of Russians to view themselves as superior and to oppress and insult non-Russians. While all the decrees of the Stalin era used that formulation, great power chauvinism, in his own remarks, Stalin interestingly more frequently used the term velikoruski chauvinism or velikoruski nationalism. Lenin, it would seem, wanted to eventually normalize the Russians as a nationality. Once purged of their chauvinism, they would function as an ordinary Soviet nation. Stalin resisted this. For him, Russian nationalism would always be an ever-present threat to the larger Soviet state. Again, the Yeltsin versus Gorbachev concern. And the political scientist Henry Hale's work actually provides support for Stalin's concern. He notes that every multinational state that has collapsed on national lines since World War II, USSR, Yugoslavia, Pakistan, Czechoslovakia, had a national unit for the majority or plurality nation. While no state that lacked such an institution, let's say China, Canada, India, Spain, has collapsed despite considerable nationalist mobilization in those countries. So this persistent tension in the status of Russia and the Russians within the USSR was a result of the combination of Lenin's and Stalin's preferences. Lenin won in getting the Soviet Union and a Russian republic, but Stalin managed the relationship and was careful to, at all costs, insist that this Russian republic not be Ruski, be Rossiyski, and that no new Russian institutions, no Communist Party, no Academy of Sciences should be formed, and that Russian national identity should always be expressed at the Soviet level and not at the Russian level. So it feels rather strange to be telling you a narrative where Lenin is more friendly to Russian nationalism than Stalin, given that, of course, after 1933, Stalin promoted an often strident chauvinist rhetoric of Russian primacy, which is often called Russian nationalist. But I think David Brandenburger was correct in his book on this discourse in calling it Russocentric, or if he had been writing in Russian, maybe Rossiyski, in its rather than Russian nationalist, because the two keys to it were that Russians should identify with the state as a whole, and that state would be conceived of as multinational, as would the RSFSR. One could even argue that the rhetoric of Russian primacy in the USSR was a kind of compensatory payment to the Russians for being denied their own Ruski institutions. That payment was reduced considerably after Stalin's death, and there was some greater Russian self-expression allowed in RSFSR institutions, like the Writers' Union. One did get some resentful Russki nationalism from people like the Derevienchiki and the Russkaya Partia movements. However, if you compare the USSR to Yugoslavia, where the Serbs were given full national institutions, one certainly finds a much stronger and more resentful nationalism emerge amongst the Serbs than did among the Russians. Indeed, during Perestroika, Russian nationalism emerged much later than the nationalism of comparably developed nationalities. And the form it took was more civic and liberal. It took several decades after 1991 for the development in Russia of a comparably resentful nationalism, leading to the wars that we're now living through. So that's the Russian question, which I think is at the heart of one of the ambiguities. In my book, I called the Russians the awkward, the RSFSR the awkward republic, and the Russians the awkward nationality, because they didn't fit into the model of how the Soviet Union functioned. As I noted at the beginning of this talk, the paradox of building nations to forestall nationalism, this tension over Russianness, were both there at the beginning of the Soviet nationalities policy, while the tension over the primordial and constructivist understandings of nationality only emerged in the 1930s. And I found and still find that this an interesting question as to why this shift in discourse occurred. Because quite clearly in the late 1930s, you start to get the discourse that we're all familiar with: Georgians as a sunny people with a joyful disposition. This being projected back in time, Kazakhs as people of the steppe with a love of the wide open plains, and how this shapes there, and the emphasis on folklore and so forth. It emerges, and yet there's absolutely no, if you look in the central discussions, there's discussions of many other policy shifts in nationalities policy, but there's absolutely no discussion of this. So I thought it needed some kind of unintentional, sort of subconscious conversion strategy story. That is, that there were some developments that led to this being adopted. And at the time, I put forward two arguments. One argued that the practice of constantly labeling oneself by nationality and attaching important life advantage to that label habituated people, including Bolsheviks, into thinking of nationality as something essential to their life and person, and so unintentionally habituated a kind of national primordialism. So even if the policy was instrumental, it was received as non-instrumental. Maybe. Second, an argument that Stalin's sort of revolution from above established statism and paternalism as the dominant political discourses and practices of the post-1933 period, and this statism tended to reify groups. Your relationship of your group to the state became central, and it led to a discourse of narodnost that had a kind of elective affinity with Volkish folkloric understandings of the nationality. But these are really just guesses. That is, I had no particular evidence for them. Whereas my third explanation for the primordial shift was different. It was quite supported by evidence and directly linked to hereditary passport nationality, which was really a key institution of Soviet primordialism. So I argued that the original Soviet nationalities policy aimed to use ethnicity to project influence across Soviet borders, exploiting cross-border communities such as Ukrainians and Moldovans who lived in Romania and Poland as well as the Soviet Union. But this logically implied that the opposite could occur, that cross-border ties could be used to project foreign influence into the USSR. During collectivization, Stalin became concerned that this was happening with resistance in the peripheries and immigration movements. And this led first to the partial deportation of diaspora nationalities such as Germans, Poles, Finns, from border regions, eventually the total deportation of Koreans, and the national operations of the Great Terror. And it was these national operations that led formally to making passport nationality inheritable. There's an NKVD decree that people were changing their passport nationalities, Germans, Poles, etc., to avoid repression. And this was made illegal. And also, it was one had to adopt one's parents' nationality. So it's 1938. It's not in 32 when the passports are established, but in 38 during the national operations of the Great Terror that you get this. So here the arguments are fully conscious and instrumental. And while I do go on to say that once you've created enemy nations, it's also much more easy to think of them as primordial, the causation can go the other way just as well. That is, the primordialism could be, from the state's perspective, from Stalin's perspective, strategic. Poles and Estonians were enemy nations in 1938, but fraternal socialist nations a decade later. So I started to develop this idea, not in my book, but much later, of another paradox, strategic primordialism, which seems like a contradiction in terms. This turn occurred simultaneously with the rehabilitation of Russianness and the emergence of the Russia-centric discourse I talked about earlier. And that discourse itself was primordialist, dredged through deep Russian military and political history for a usable past in the face of probable war. So there was more strategic primordialism. But more contradictory, and this is where I wanted to get to my second sort of contradiction, was that it was also accompanied by a series of moves promoting ethnic or national consolidation. In 1936, Stalin declared the USSR was made up of 60 nationalities, requiring a scramble amongst ethnographers to decide which of the more than 100 nationalities that they claimed existed had to be eliminated. And you saw many eliminated. You saw national Soviets at the district and village level eliminated. You saw national institutions eliminated in the Russian regions of the RSFSR and in Georgia. And this set up this contradiction in Soviet policy I discussed earlier between a process of national consolidation that favored titular nationalities assimilating non-Russians, and the primordialist institution of heritable passport nationality, which suggested that this can't occur. And the exact same contradiction would occur at the Soviet level later with the idea of the Soviet nation, consolidation, and socialist nations, primordialism. So, you could say that the policies were simply ad hoc or inconsistent. But if we view the primordial turn as strategic rather than essential, we can also view national consolidation as being strategic in one sphere and primordialism in another. That is, one doesn't need to argue that the primordialism was in some sense a sincere conversion. It could be tactical. I want last to the, before I turn to 1991 and conclude, to discuss the genre of ethnogenesis. Because it's the curious element. So this is, in one sense, is an academic genre. It emerges in 1938 to 1940. There's a series of Academy of Science meetings that discuss it. But as Victor Schnirelman has shown in his book, The Value of the Past, which is a 50-year sort of study of ethnogenic warfare, if you will, by Georgian academics against Abkhaz and Ossetian academics and Azerbaijani and Armenian academics against one another, it turned into a key component of political legitimation. The publication of ethnogenetic studies that seek led to denunciations to Moscow. It led to Republican Party resolutions. It led to a couple of public riots in Abkhazia after Georgian ethnogenetic studies were found. So it wasn't simply an academic genre. It had political consequences. And the consequences ran sort of as follows. Titular status brings benefits to the party elite and its clients, in particular after the 1930s. Benefits to the producers of national culture and identity, that is the художественная интеллигенция, and to a lesser extent to the public at large through the psychic benefits of titular status and affirmative action that went with it. Titular status is earned by being the коренный народ of a territory, and indigeneity is determined by the length of ethnic national residence on a given territory. And so it is the job of the ethnogeneticist to extend the titular nation's residence as far back in time as possible and to eliminate the presence of contemporary rivals to the titular nation's territories. So points 1 and 2, the idea that nationality brought with it benefits in terms of promotions and so forth, and the idea that the коренный народ should be the titular nationality, those were there from the beginning. But this idea of the deep primordial presence of the nationality is something that is new and gave ethnogenesis genre its political significance. So it's pretty easy to see why this genre developed from the perspective of the Republican elites. What's less clear is why it should be endorsed by the center and by Stalin. So what were the tactics here? The accounts of the scholarly origins of ethnogenesis make very clear that it was a response to Nazi Germany's claims for age-old German presence on the Slavic land. So it was an instrumental response that was meant to refute that and to show that, in fact, the Germans were residing on age-old Slavic land. But this does little for us to wonder why it was immediately institutionalized at the Republican levels. You already start to have ethnogenetic studies during World War I, and after World War II, you have an ethnogeneticist, a person that wrote ethnogenetic studies, become the first party secretary of Tajikistan. So it's a very successful genre. The danger of its use for nationalist purposes is not hard to see, and Stalin was a suspicious man with regard to nationalism, among other things. It's not clear why it was necessitated. The Russians were the state, could be viewed as a state-creating people, and you could simply have an ethnogenetic story that validating the possession of the imperial space. It could be a case of Soviet mimesis. In the Soviet Union, you tend to have everything spread to republics, even whether it makes sense or not. Everybody has the same academies, the writers' union, and so forth. But I think Yuri Slozkin makes a persuasive case in his account that Stalin actually endorsed primordialism and ethnogenesis in the linguistic intervention of 1951 to 52, particularly practiced by Georgian scholars. So perhaps Stalin's strategic primordialism extended to backing Republican primordialism. And in fact, this thought sort of came to me when I was reading about the attempts to lay claim to Azerbaijani, Turkish, and Turkish and Iranian territory for Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia after World War II. Because in those cases, the ethnogeneticists are set to work to find a territorial claim on the presence of these territories. These were ginned up. The claims to the territory were asserted based upon them, and equally unshamefacedly retracted when the gambit failed. But the scholars involved in this transparently strategic foreign policy primordialism were at the same time writing domestic policy primordialist works. So the same people that were writing tracts whose implicit message was that, that Iranian Azerbaijan should be linked to Soviet Azerbaijan were writing tracts whose implicit position was that Nagorno-Karabakh belonged to Azerbaijan and not to the Soviet, to Armenia and vice versa. What does this mean? If we return to the shifts in Korenizatsiya that occurred in 1933, one could say that at that time period, Stalin de-emphasized linguistic and cadre affirmative action, but he did not abolish them. And he intensified the promotion of national culture in a primordialist vein. He did not abolish Korenizatsiya because he thought, and always thought, in my opinion, that it worked. It worked in a constructivist idiom, but perhaps it worked even better in a primordialist idiom, was the idea. If the point was to diffuse nationalism by granting the forms of nationality, why not grant a grandiose and ancient national history? Wouldn't that make Korenizatsiya work better? Wouldn't it have greater foreign policy utility? Wouldn't it provide a better idiom when it was necessary to repress or confront enemy nations? Yes, it might breed some proto-nationalist sentiment amongst the intelligentsia and party cadres, but that could easily be dealt with through periodic propaganda and repressive campaigns. It sometimes seems that the Soviet nationalities policy under Stalin was a machine for producing and then repressing national sentiments. But from Stalin's perspective, perhaps that was a feature, not a bug. Stalin was a nationalities realist. Perhaps nations would disappear when communism triumphed worldwide, as he repeatedly stated, to save the appearances. But it would certainly not happen on his watch or any time in the foreseeable future. Nations were a fact of life, and properly managed could serve to strengthen a great socialist state, or empire, if you must. So Stalin was, in that sense, a strategic primordialist. So I've covered a fair amount of territory. Let me sum up and conclude. The original Soviet nationalities policy had a number of paradoxes or tensions. One inhered in the promotion of nationhood to prevent nationalism, another in the status of the Russians, and a third in the contradiction between primordial nationality and constructivist accounts, one making way for consolidation, one for permanent nations. In the titular national-minority conflict, consolidation allowed for assimilation of national minorities into the titular majority, Talish into Azeri, Mingrelian into Georgian, and so forth. While in the Republic Center conflict, consolidation allowed for assimilation into the new Sovietsky Narod, while primordialism favored the preservation of socialist nationhood in an explicitly composite multinational state. So you have this situation where it's advantageous for national leaders to be primordialist vis-a-vis the center, and it's disadvantage for them to be primordialist vis-a-vis their, so the contradiction exists there. My argument here is simply that Stalin understood these things better than one gives him attention for, and he knew how to run the machine more or less. But he handed that over he handed over a very, very difficult policy machine to run to his successors. And after Khrushchev's, spirited but largely failed attempts to change the nationalities regime in 58, 59, with Brezhnev, one settles into sort of stasis where the discursive system becomes rigidified, and the contradictions we've traced here start to function with less regulation. The machine for producing folkloric nationalism continued to overproduce national cultural cadres. The central state ceased to be the motive force in constructing and managing its nations, and instead acted defensively to limit the growth of unwanted national cultural production. More intensively in core regions like Ukraine, much less so in regions like the Transcaucasus. Genres emerged to express, cultivate, and propagate proto-nationalist and sometimes overtly national sentiment at the Republican level. Ethnogenesis was one such genre, village prose and other, folkloric dance, and various other genres of what Violette Davlyutina called the Rustic Turn in the 1970s did it. Colonization was now driven from below as titular national First Party secretaries formed patron-client networks capable of running their republics. An ethnic Russki national movement emerged, also centered in the cultural intelligentsia. When perestroika led to an opening of the public sphere, the national cultural intelligentsia in many republics was set to convert an increasingly large segment of the population to the national cause and to the subjective perception of empire. In almost all republics, it was the national cultural intelligentsia whose overproduction had its origins in Stalin's Primordial Turn that led the national popular fronts, and in some cases from Landsbergis to Gamsachurdia to Petrosian, took over the leadership of newly independent states. More frequently, almost universally in Central Asia, the national First Party secretaries stepped in with their patronage networks. In Russia, of course, Lenin's Russian Republican institutions were taken over by Yeltsin and used to seize power and end the Soviet Union. There are, of course, many stories of how we got from the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922 to its demise in 1991. This is just one of them. Thank you.